Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming to this session on smart cities. My name is Professor William Webster. I'm the chair of this session. I'm going to start by just giving a general introduction to the session, introducing the speakers. I won't be interviewing them. Introducing the speakers. As you can see, it's quite a cosy setting. I've been given instructions that all the speakers have to talk directly in the microphone. Later on, when we have the questions and answers, all the questions will have to be repeated so that we can repeat them into the microphone so that they can be recorded correctly. So in the traditions of Cpdp, the session will be recorded, it will be available online. It's very cosy up here at the front, so we're going to be doing a bit of shuffling so that everybody can present. We're sharing the platform with a grand piano, which you can't see, but it's cramping our style a little bit. Before we get started, I did want to do a couple of plugs. First of all, for my own research centre, which is called CRISP, the Centre for Research into Information, Surveillance and Privacy, shared with St Andrews University in Scotland and the University of Edinburgh, a research centre interested in the consequences and impacts of surveillance. I also have a research project, an ESRC-funded research project on smart cities, which is why I'm very pleased I'm chairing this session, looking at the co-creation of citizen engagement. That's called SmartGov. The session this morning is going to look at smart cities with an angle of privacy and surveillance. So we see lots of policy rhetoric about how new technologies can be used in urban environments around the smart cities agenda. There's lots of public policy rhetoric. There's lots of experimentation around new technology to see what the technology can deliver. I think this session is going to try and unpick some of those ideas, looking specifically at privacy angles, looking at surveillance angles, but also looking at policy practice and a few theoretical considerations. We have three excellent speakers. We have an excellent rapporteur as well. We did have a speaker lined up from Microsoft, who was unable to make it, so we're going to extend the presentation slightly. I've told the speakers to speak for a little bit longer, but I'll be keeping the session to time because there's a session immediately after ours. It's very dark up here, so let me turn over my notes. Okay, so just as a general introduction to the three speakers, we have Gemma Galdon-Clavell from Eticas Consulting. She's a co-founder of Eticas. She sits on the board of Privacy International, and she's interested in legal, ethical impacts of technology and the practices in and around smart cities. We have Maria Murphy from Maynooth University in Ireland. She's a lecturer in law. She's going to speak about European Convention of Human Rights, and her main research interests are privacy law, surveillance, and human rights. We have Michael Nagenborg from the University of Twente in the Netherlands. He's the managing director of the 4TU Centre for Ethics and Technologies. He's a philosopher interested in the interplay between cities, technologies, and human self-understanding. And we have David Murakami Wood from the Surveillance Studies Centre at Queen's University in Canada. He's one of the driving forces behind the creation of the Surveillance Studies Network and the journal Surveillance and Society. He's currently doing some research around security and surveillance in smart city environments, and his project UBICITY is one of the sponsors of this panel. So my main task is nearly over. My main job from this point onwards is to keep the panel to time. I'm going to pass over to David, who's going to do a general introduction, and then we'll move on to the three speakers. Now, David, take care of the microphone.
I will. Thanks, Will. It's very small up here, which is lucky because I'm also very small, so that's good. Okay, thank you all for coming this morning. The idea of this panel, when I first got it together, was really to bring into a sharp focus issues of surveillance and privacy in smart cities. Now, all of us in different ways are researching smart cities, and in some ways, when I first started doing this project 2 or 3 years ago, the first thing I heard was that smart cities are already over. Smart cities in some ways, although they're everywhere at the moment, are a very old idea. And when I mentioned my project to my postdoctoral mentor, Stephen Graham, who's one of the advisors on my project, the author of Splintering Urbanism, a really excellent book on how digital technologies have transformed the city, his face fell. And he went, "Oh, not that again." I mean, essentially what he said was this is the same thing over from the 1990s as digital cities or cyber cities, just recast in a new light. Every generation seems to have this new version. Before that, it was information cities or information society. We reinvent it every 10 or 20 years. And there's something to be said for that view. I'm not saying dismissing it entirely. We're certainly seeing many of the same solutions packaged up again in new, more glittery, neon-soaked kind of packaging. So we're seeing, for example, one of the main initiatives that New York City has recently been promoting is this sort of digital kiosks where old phone booths are repurposed as sort of wireless points and so on. It's so similar to the idea of these cyber kiosks that existed in the mid-90s at many cities across Europe. Any of you who've been involved in the Eurocities knowledge networks will know these kinds of things have been promoted for a very long time. This is nothing new. And yet every time people are kind of, wow, this is a new solution. It's really exciting. I was amused that one of the first responses to this telephone booth idea, by the way, in New York, was a certain adult emporium which decided to build its own cyber booth outside where you could access the wares of that adult shop. So people immediately started to kind of mock the idea right from the very beginning. However, there's a more serious side to this way in which cyber cities and smart cities have come about recently. My background is actually looking at security, and particularly security intelligence. And I immediately started to see, when I was looking at the rise of smart cities, similarities and parallels with the ways in which military thinking had started to seep into the urban agenda, especially in the 1990s, through American military strategy thinking, so-called military operations in urban terrain, or MOUT. And these military thinkers were essentially starting to think about how they could operate which essentially, as we saw from the 2000s, in places like Baghdad and so on, and how they could dominate the entire urban landscape. And the solutions they were coming up with were sensor webs placed across the urban landscape, which would then provide real-time information to soldiers. Essentially, what we were talking about was smart cities, but they were smart cities for entirely military purposes. Now, I'm not going to stand here and say that, because there are military versions, all smart cities are intrinsically military and therefore we have to reject them. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that the same kinds of thinking are coming together from various different directions. And while in the EU we tend to prioritize and to think about more the civil and especially sort of more convivial and social uses of the smart city, there's a whole parallel set of thinkings that come and histories that come into this too. Now, until recently, a lot of this parallel thinking in security and military smart cities was kept very separate. It was a separate domain. The military did that, and you didn't see it in the conventional presentation of smart cities. However, what I've been noticing going to some of the industry expos in recent years is that now, if you like, security is coming out of the darkness and into the forefront of smart city thinking, and this is what prompted my project. It's no longer the case that people are dismissing security or thinking of it as a subsidiary issue, but it's coming back in as one of the major driving forces of smart city thinking. When I first started to go into industry expos a few years ago, there was only a small number of companies like Thales, for example, who were really overtly talking about the security aspects of smart cities. And these are specifically originally military companies. But now we're seeing Microsoft, IBM, many of the others overtly talking about security as one of the major driving forces. And we're seeing some of the stuff that we're more familiar with from surveillance studies, especially around intelligent CCTV systems being integrated and being promoted as a full part of this. Now, this shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. Anybody who's been following smart city technology from the beginning, smart cities rely fundamentally on surveillance. They cannot be a smart city without surveillance. Essentially, the smart city relies on ubiquitous sensor platforms of various kinds, which collect data and transform it into actionable information. This data ranges from the kind of aggregate data on things like climate and sewage and so on, which we wouldn't be too concerned about in most cases, to very much personal data. At one of the first Smart City Expos I went to, several speakers, and without much of a sense of irony about it, were referring to human beings as sensors on legs. And this is because not only because the data from those people themselves is useful, but also that humans as mobile elements of the urban environment are walking around collecting data in various ways and can be used essentially as kind of sensors in themselves, or as can be platforms essentially. Now, of course, those of us who are interested in artificial intelligence and things like this, like as Michael is going to talk about later, will be very interested in how human beings have come to be seen as part of a system as opposed to individuals with rights, which is the usual ways we're used to talking about them. I can assure you that in many smart city presentations, the idea of human beings as individuals with rights is very much a secondary consideration. And what we're seeing in many cases, especially from some of the corporate presentations of smart cities, is the idea that human beings are essentially to be woven into a mechanical, in this case, digital mechanical kind of system. It reminds me a lot of how Bill Gates used to talk about the .NET project. If you remember this a few years ago, Bill Gates had a bit of a meltdown. Well, you wouldn't call it a meltdown. In one of his, he doesn't really melt down in a very mild way that he does, in a public presentation where he was complaining about the lack of uptake of .NET. Why weren't people, really getting into this amazing system for securing our identities online? And his basic, what he said is, they realize that if they don't take part, it won't work. And basically, the logic here is that human beings are essentially secondary to the system. That in order for the system to work, human beings have to conform to the system. And I'm seeing a lot of the same kind of logic being used with regards to smart cities now. You can have all the benefits, the conviviality, the environmental sustainability, all of these things, but the fundamental access point, the entry point for this is conforming. You have to conform to the system. And increasing what we're seeing is a competition between various different, various different major corporate dominated views of what a smart city would be. And it's not so much of whether you're going to have a smart city or not, but whether you're going to have the Microsoft ecology driving your smart city, or the IBM system, or Cisco, or various other players who are coming into this. But the choice again is essentially which one of these do you decide to go with, and after that there's very little choice, because essentially this is the infrastructure that runs your city from then on. That's the ideal. Of course it doesn't work, which is the other thing that people don't often talk about. For example, one of the most promoted smart city exemplars in the world is the Rio de Janeiro smart city. You've seen the pictures of the control room. You've seen the happy, smiling faces of the security people who think this is really great in helping them to run their city. It was promoted as the way in which Rio managed to host the Olympic Games. This was all because of this smart city network. If you've ever been to Rio de Janeiro, the idea that this is a city that is smart and under control is a completely ludicrous notion. While the Olympic Games were going on, they were still running gang battles in various favelas. Just after the Olympic Games, gangs in one particular favela shot down a police helicopter. This is not a city that is under control in that sense. And whatever Mayor Eduardo Paes says about the fact he can run his city remotely from anywhere in the world, as he said in his TED Talks, this is not actually the case when it comes to the practical management of the city. It's not a smart city for everyone. In this sense, basically, there's some kinds of smartness that help to uphold the lives of certain people, and for the rest of it, it's a rather repressive and malfunctioning system. And I think there's something else to bear in mind as we go on, is who is the smart city for? Who does the smart city provide various functions for, whether it's security, privacy, environmental sustainability, and who is it designed essentially to exclude or to control? I think it's very, as an academic, one of my ways into this is through the post-colonial theory of Achille Mbembe, one of my favorite thinkers who developed the idea based on Michel Foucault's biopolitics of necropolitics, the form that excludes certain people, basically marks them out for death and for kind of, various ill treatment. Essentially, the smart city is one of many different kinds of digital systems that creates boundaries that mark in who is to be included and who is to be provided for and who is to be excluded and who is to be kind of basically policed out of the city. I don't think I'm going to say much more than that, other than to carry on to say these are some of the questions we have to bear in mind. And I hope our speakers are going to address these in various ways. I know Michael is going to concentrate on some of the technical aspects of smart cities, particularly on how it relates to artificial intelligence. And then Maria is going to talk more about how law can provide certain kinds of, regulation, remedy, whatever you might want to call it. And then Gemma is going to talk more in practical terms about how we can, respond to live in or live against smart cities in various ways. Hopefully there'll be some really good discussion afterwards. I'm happy to take part in those questions too. I apologize for the lack of panelists. We did have originally Adam Greenfield lined up, and unfortunately he's very ill and has been ill and couldn't be here. Microsoft then let us down very sadly, so we haven't got 4 panelists. But it means more time for discussion. So this is the good thing, and I hope we'll take advantage of that. I'll pass it over to Michael now.
Okay. Thank you very much for this great introduction. So, quickly have to see where my slides are. Here we go. Okay, and it's slideshow. No, it's a little one down here. No, wrong. Yeah, great.
You're a Mac user, right?
Yeah, I'm a Mac user. Yep. So now I have to find out how to switch slides. What is the next step? So thank you very much for having me here. Well, if you invite a philosopher, it might happen that you end up with a little bit more of an abstract talk, and yeah, that is what I'm going to do today. I partly chose the topic of AI and smart cities in order to do justice to the theme of this conference, the age of intelligence machines. So, of course, I will start with discussing, can machines be intelligent? And I also choose this topic because it's quite hard to get an overall grip on smart cities, because there are so many variations at the moment when we look at the different versions and visions of smart cities. It can be heavily technology-driven, company-driven visions, like the original discussion we had about IBM's idea of a smarter planet. It can be very local, specialized platform initiatives. So, for example, we have about 200 living labs now all over Europe, which are connected in parts to smart city projects. So it can also mean we have a heavy emphasis on citizen participation. So I thought, okay, what can I bring to the panel? I actually thought, I bring something pretty old. I bring in the discussion on AI, and here we go. So the first thing, let's start with a big one. Let's try to define intelligence. Now, Alan Turing gave up on that one. I'm not that smart as Alan Turing. Whole conference are dedicated to it, but bear with me. Here's my take on intelligence. So as a philosopher, in order to prepare this talk, I did go back reading John Dewey, who has a lot of things to say about intelligence. One of the things that I got from his writings is intelligence is not a property. Intelligence includes actions and activities. So we ascribe the property of being intelligence when we observe certain kinds of behavior. One important kind of behavior here is dealing with data, information, symbols, science, however you would like to call it. I prefer to call it from science, but let's for context of this talk, let's say dealing with data and symbols is one of the main things that you expect from an intelligent entity. And one of the important things that we expect from an intelligent entity is that it is able to connect dots, plenty of dots, information coming in. And an intelligent being should be able to single out the relevant ones. So in technical terms, make a distinction between noise and signal. That would be a basis level of intelligence. And we usually do that by, actually connecting dots. So what information makes sense, if we talk about humans, in relation to other elements here? And if something new comes in, can I connect it to what I always see as being important? So connecting dots, if the system is able to do that, and it's not on a completely random base, I would consider it to be intelligent. So that is my answer to, can machines be intelligent? Yes, they can be intelligent, but they are not intelligent in the way that we are. And that is important to keep in mind. So just briefly, how I got into this whole discussion. So I'm a philosopher of technology. I'm particularly interested in how technology shapes human self-understanding, as I call it, or on an individual level, how does technology shape human actions and perceptions? So how does technology allow us to see and perceive the world, and what kind of activities do technologies allow us to do, and what kind of activities are becoming less likely to be done once technology becomes part of it. And on the societal level, I'm interested in how technologies shape interactions between individuals and groups. So neither surveillance nor cities can be reduced to technologies, but technologies do enable and shape surveillance processes as well as urban governance. So technology plays a role here. And both cities and surveillance do shape individual behavior as well as perception. So keep in mind the basic definition provided by David Line that surveillance is a two-step process with, in the second step, aims to manage behavior of people. And cities do the same thing. Urban planning is all about shaping human behavior. Making cities more walkable, for example, can be translated to designing cities in such a way that people are more likely to walk. And of course, they also shape the interaction between individuals and groups. So I hope that at this point already somebody made a strong connection to surveillance and smart cities. David did. I just tried to do so a little bit. Just as a reminder, here's a quote from a paper by Francesco Clauser and Albert Albrechtslund, where we also talk about the emerging surveillance assemblage in smart cities. So let's take that for granted. Now, why I'm interested in data protection? Well, I'm interested in human-technology relation. And one of my first take-home messages is thinking about data protection is thinking about human-technology relations. If data protection regulations, for example, prohibited a certain kind of data to be used, that has impact on technology. And that is the way how it should be, this way around, not the other way around. So start first, what kind of data protection, what kind of privacy we would like to join, what kind of social values we would like to promote, and then to see how technology might be helpful in this case. So, what brought me to AI here is that AI potentially undermines fundamental data protection principles. And that is, I would say, for a good part of this room, well known, but still I would like to bring it on the table because I not see too many of this discussion in the smart city literature. On one hand, AI enables big data practices. And big data tends to undermine purpose specification. The whole idea of make use of all the data that you can get in order to get knowledgeable about certain domains in the city undermines any precise purpose specification beforehand. And AI plays a role in it because you cannot do big data without any form of AI. Second, AI undermines informed consent. That is what I would like to focus on. So let me briefly step back. So why is AI hardly ever mentioned in the discussion on smart cities? It's not a common term. In all the readings I did, it hardly is ever mentioned. I think it's partly due to rebranding. We have been promised so often that the AI revolution is happening this year that nobody really would like to repeat that claim. However, machine learning is a subdiscipline of AI. It's as simple as that. If you go to a computer science handbook, that is where you will find it. Machine learning is a kind of AI. Quite simple. But it sounds way more sexy at the moment than AI again. In the academic discourse, I would say it has to do with a good deal of demystification. There are a lot of discussions about AI, about strong AI, human-style AI, that are really distracting. And I have to acknowledge my own field philosophy contributed a large deal to this mystification of AI. So what we now see are discussions about code, programs, algorithms. Algorithms sometimes tends to be this mystical being that is existing outside society, doing things and controlling us. So that I would say is a bad inheritance of this AI discussion, but my take on it is that algorithms do not exist in isolation. Also, algorithms are part of society, and they should be recognized as that. They are embedded in human practices, they are embedded in human interaction, they depend on humans, and they shape our lives. So, on one hand, it's a good thing that we have no strong focus on AI in the discussion, but some things got lost. So, let's focus a little bit on AI and what we can learn from old writings on it. So actually, my main argument goes back to a paper by Herman Tavani from the late 90s. So that is how old this discussion is. There are two ways to think about AI. On one hand, you can focus on intelligence. And then it's very, very likely that you will think about human kind of intelligence because that is the kind of intelligence we know best more, we are most familiar with. So that would be a kind of research where we try to actually build a human mind by a machine. It's not really useful. It's fancy, it's interesting, might give us interesting insights. I fully understand why people are still trying to build an artificial human brain, that's fine. But in practical terms, it's not the most interesting one, because if you need human-style intelligence, there are plenty of humans left on the streets. So the answer then would be education and so on, not building machines that can do exactly the same things as a human being could do. What is more interesting is to look into an artificial intelligence. So technologies that do intelligence tasks, but differently from human beings. So I would argue in favor of a complementary design of artificial intelligence that allows us to delegate tasks that traditionally would thought of as being require intelligence to machines that do that in a different way than a human being would do it. And this is where it gets complicated. So a complementary design would embrace the difference between human intelligence and artificial intelligence. So we are precisely using these kinds of machines because they are thinking differently than we are. They might provide us with insights that we cannot get, neither in the time that they can get it, nor in the way that they can get it. However, the difference between human intelligence and machine intelligence may hinder communication interaction between humans and machines. So the more artificial intelligence deviates from human-style intelligence, it becomes harder and harder to understand what the machine is actually doing. So there is this basic tension here. And that is actually what brings us to the concern about informed consent. AI, as underlying of big data practices, is precisely about looking for something, without the people being involved knowing what exactly they are looking for. So how can you consent to a form of data procedure where you don't know which data will be relevant and what the meaning of that data is to the system? So we might have some expectations when it comes to how humans will deal with a certain piece of information I reveal this, but we have no idea how machines might make sense of it. Going back to the picture of connecting the dots, we don't know what connections will be made. We will not even know which data point is relevant in that particular network. What we see as a total trivial fact can be the trigger in the machine. So therefore, AI has a good potential to undermine any form of informed consent. And to bring this all together, smart cities, sensors everywhere, undermining potentially purpose specification, enabling big data practices, where AI enables us to look for something. So that, for me, is the basic challenge that we are confronted with in smart cities as soon as we build or integrate AI. And I would make the claim that as soon as we talk about big data, we talk about machine learning, we talk about AI, and we talk about this principal challenge. So to end up with some big claims. So I was thinking hard if I should really do that, but I do that to myself. So looking back into the literature, I came across Willem Flusser's writing, who was writing in the late 1880s about visions of future cities. Of course, he didn't talk about smart cities, but this is what I found. He reminded that at that point it has become minimally possible to think that politics could be handed over to artificial intelligence and economics to robots, and the humans could be concentrated on programming these robots. What I find fascinating about this quote is that the humans still are programming the robots, but politics is being done by machines, which might tell us a lot about the way that Flusser was thinking about politics in his days. However, this is not only utopian thinking. If we go back to a white paper Rob Kitchen has published last year, he reminds us that the fundamental question of what kind of cities do we want to create and live in is reduced to technological issues. So we now try to solve different problems in different domains, but we don't ask this overall question anymore. From my perspective, it's hard to avoid that technology will influence the way that we address this question if we raise it at all. But my last plea would be, could we please leave that answer not to the machine? Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm just trying to make sure my notes don't slide off the lectern here. Today I want to talk about the potential role of human rights in smart cities. And in particular, I want to look at the potential role of the European Convention on Human Rights and how the smart city should be viewed through the prism of the European Convention on Human Rights. The Article 8, right to respect for private life, is of course the most relevant right, but freedom of expression, freedom of association will also have clear pertinence here. The convention provisions are, of course, very sparse, and we have to look to case law to be able to fill out what those rights really entail. We have some recent-ish cases on this that I think actually are quite relevant in the smart city context. Because of its relevance and its influence, I'll also touch on the Court of Justice of the European Union's position in this area. I'd just like to make it clear that while human rights law is very unlikely to make any significant difference in terms of solving all the problems of the smart city, I do believe that it can be a very useful tool for discussion and persuasion, if nothing else. And I will actually go further and say that I think human rights law can provide us with a useful framework to lay out some potential solutions for improvement. So challenges to privacy as come about in the smart city can be addressed to some extent by data protection law. We're all aware of how the GDPR lays out provisions on privacy impact assessments, lays out provisions on privacy by design. But as Michael's laid out very well, and many other scholars have laid out as well, there's serious shortcomings in the modern data processing environment, whether it's the difficulties of informed consent, or whether it's problems about the need for individualized, personalized data for data protection law to become relevant. There's also challenges in the traditional conception of privacy, that generally our conception of privacy doesn't include the type of group harms that are very common in the smart city, the type of societal harms that come from the algorithmic processing of very large data sets. So while the problems raised by such actions may not fully come within the traditional conception of privacy, I would argue that the Article 8 right to respect for private life and the Convention is significantly or sufficiently flexible and malleable to actually respond to some of these issues, and trends in jurisprudence actually support this point. So when classical privacy rights are at risk, it's very easy to identify the individual harm and the individual affective. But this is more difficult when we're talking about the processing of big data, in large part because the harm is often somewhat intangible or perhaps even speculative in some cases. This captures part of the difficulties of regulating big data and smart cities, but actually also indicate the flaws in our conceptions of privacy, how traditional conceptions of privacy don't actually respond to the current technological reality. So a strict reading of the Convention, as I'm sure you all know, would suggest that you need to have individual harm to be able to take a case before the court, but the court has been very, very flexible in surveillance context, recognising that due to the difficulty of showing a concrete harm, concrete evidence, that you can actually challenge surveillance legislation based on its mere existence. This is based on the fact that the existence of such legislation can actually pose a threat, pose a menace to all individuals who wish to communicate with each other. This reflects the European Court of Human Rights' desire and commitment to the effectiveness of Article 8, that it needs to be effective in practice and needs to respond to current conditions. And this principle has very much been reiterated and reiterated very strongly in the recent-ish decisions of Zakharov and Szabo and Visi, which was delivered around this time last year. So the desire of the court to retain the effectiveness of Article 8 and the Convention should be borne in mind when thinking about appropriate approaches to the privacy problems of the smart city. While privacy laws are often accused of lagging behind technological and societal developments, it's very clear that the Convention, as interpreted by the court, is a living instrument that has to respond to modern conditions and changing societal realities. So even though the living instrument doctrine is generally used in combination with some new trends or additional signs of consensus amongst the various party states, when the fundamental principles of the Convention are being threatened, I believe it makes sense to search for novel solutions to these privacy problems. So the court has always been responsive to technological advances, recognizing that privacy is, of course, a very broad right, not susceptible to exhaustive definition. It goes as far to say that part of your private lives include the ability to create relationships with others, develop your personality, and for the individual moving through the constantly surveilled smart city, those are very pertinent rights. So from this starting point of inclusivity, the court has included many new types of technological intrusions as privacy infringements, all the way from interception of post up until the monitoring of email. Now, a particularly notable approach of the court has been acknowledging as potentially private things which would not classically have been considered. And so we see this in the court recognizing intrusions can occur based on the use of publicly available information. So we found intrusions associated with DNA databases, intrusions associated with GPS tracking, and of course the logging of travel records. Well, so what, you might say? You know, everyone in this room would probably guess there's some privacy implications, Article 8 implications, for many of the different elements of a smart city. That goes without saying. But we're not just talking about any one individual element. We're talking about the cumulative effect on society as we know it and the very, very broad impacts that may have when you have such an extensive surveillance apparatus. So even though the European Court of Human Rights has found Article 8 to be of a more individual rather than collective character in previous cases, it has also recognised the broad societal implications of restricted privacy. We can go all the way back to class to hear the court talk about how surveillance can undermine democracy as well as defend it. And we've seen this reiterated yet again in the more recent decisions of Zakharov and Szabo. So the omnipresent collection of information that many of the smart city ideology present as a positive clearly has the potential to hamper communication, very broad, as was mentioned in some of the earlier talk, generalized chilling effect that could be very damaging in a democratic society. Considering democratic society is a core foundational principle of the Council of Europe that suggests there should be some strong action taken. Of key relevance, in my opinion, is some of the language used in Szabo and Vizi, the case delivered by the court around this time last year, where the court talked about the very, very serious interference that occurs when a government has access to a profile, a very, very detailed profile about individuals and their relationships and how they live their lives. Not only did the court recognise this as a very serious interference, but it said it was an even more serious interference than the previously identified serious interferences that inspired the very detailed legislative standards set out in Huvig and Kroslin and repeated again and again in all the cases subsequently. This is clearly quite a strong statement of intent, in my opinion, of the court to actually address these new developing technological challenges. So state access to private data sets is, in my opinion, a very significant threat to privacy currently. In the world of ubiquitous collection, traditional modes of talking about privacy in this current time really do crumble on close scrutiny. Ideas like the third-party doctrine, ideas like reasonable expectations of privacy just don't hold up to scrutiny. And we've seen this at the Court of Justice of the European Union as well, of course, with recognition that metadata, and not just contents data, has significant influences on your private life, and that significant safeguards will need to be put in place to allow for this. In Ireland, my country, in spite of actually being the birthplace of the Digital Rights Ireland ruling, we still haven't actually gotten rid of the implementing legislation that inspired a lot of that case. It's still in force, and there's still no judicial authorization for the access to that data. Now, in my opinion, that's just an example of one government in one particular instance failing to live up to its privacy obligations or its human rights obligations. Perhaps even more concerning, at least in my opinion, is the fact that we have this permissive clause in our data protection law. This permissive clause permits data controllers to share personal data, all types of personal data, including content data, from all types of services, including potentially email service providers, to share information voluntarily with law enforcement and the taxman and all other sorts of authorities, as long as it's in the investigation of crime. Now, using such a voluntary system clearly circumvents all the safeguards that a particular law might have in place, sidelines the interests of data subjects, and leads to a type of opacity that really isn't acceptable in any type of modern democracy. The news is currently full of law enforcement globally accessing these private data sets, whether it's accessing DNA databases from 23andMe or accessing your heart temperature provided by Fitbit, or, as has been covered extensively in all the media recently, the access to audio recordings from the Amazon Echo. Now, for me, even more interesting in that Amazon Echo case was the role played by the smart meter readings. Considering a lot of us are supposed to have smart meters if we don't already by 2020, the lack of a choice there is particularly problematic. But of course, as we know, in a smart city, this is going to be a recurring issue, that even if you do occasionally have the opportunity to opt out of a certain type of surveillance, it will the deleterious effect of opting out will very often make that choice pretty illusory. So if this tide of ubiquitous collection is to continue, we seriously need to reevaluate the relationships of the government to private companies, these private companies who maintain so much data about us. This is not to underestimate the role of such companies or to diminish the privacy interferences that can occur with private collection, but it does acknowledge the particular role state use of data. You know, governments have the power to lock you up, and that is a significant difference in terms of how we all live our lives. So while the smart city advocates may often actually hail the fact that we have these data sharing arrangements and the positive benefits they can bring about, due to the significant threat to democracy associated with this type of integration, I think it's important to actually reconsider how this relationship operates, make sure there's very strong safeguards, as you may find inspired by Szabo and previous case law, to guide this. Human rights courts from the Court of Justice of the European Union, Digital Rights Ireland, and the European Court of Human Rights, and Szabo and Zakharov and several other cases, you know, even going back to Marper, have increasingly spoken out against mass surveillance, have increasingly spoken out about blanket surveillance with no individualized or reasonable suspicion being associated with any form of targeting. Well, it seems to me that if we don't seriously reconsider the boundaries between private companies and government actors, then those cases are really going to read in future legal textbooks and future philosophical documents more as death cries than as any serious benefit for privacy. Thank you.
Okay, so I've changed my slides, so I'm gonna have to, yeah. So give me a few seconds to get the right presentation. And let me start by saying that it's an absolute honor for me to be in this panel. I don't think that the panel members realize what a great impact they've had on my work and how much of a mentoring role they've played. So thank you for being there and doing what you do. I'm a bit of a fan here. So I think my presentation matches quite well with what went before, but I'm going to take you to different places. I've worked on smart cities from different perspectives over the years. Initially from academia, and now more involved in policy and working with actual cities to improve the data strategies when it comes to the smart city, but not only the smart city. So one of the things that I did a few years ago was collaborate in an exhibition on big data in Barcelona, and we were asked to map all the spaces in a city where data of citizens is being gathered. And that's what we came up with. Every red dot is a point of data capture. So that's what the smart city actually looks like. And one of the things we wanted to highlight with this is that smart is surveillance. Like everything smart spies on you. There's no exception to this rule. And I think that this picture visualizes it quite well. I tried to grasp all this in a paper that I wrote in 2012 when I was trying to raise the issue of the smart cities in the surveillance community, because back then it was massively overlooked. I think that's changed over the years. And in 2013, I was asked to write a document for the one of the magazines, one of the journals of the city of Barcelona, talking about smart cities. And I've been very critical of smart cities ever since I worked on cities and technology. And I wrote this piece, Smart Cities with No Future, where I had to put some of the things that I was saying in an hypothetical future, because it was too much of a... It would have been considered just too aggressive to unveil how many things were not working with a smart city. Actually, after publishing this, someone went around all the offices in the building where they commissioned the journal, asking who had dared to ask me to write this piece. But basically, what I highlighted was how many smart city tech failures there were, how many things were being highlighted as these poster tech for the smart city were actually not working, and some of them had never ever worked. And regardless of this, you still had people hailing them as great examples of how we can improve efficiency and how the city works. They had never ever worked, and no one dared say that. That also led to a policy failure. I guess you've all heard about Barcelona as this great smart city, and some things have worked, some things have been done well, but others haven't. Barcelona gave itself to anyone developing smart city technology as a test bed for them to try them in the public space, and that didn't work. Most of those initiatives ended up abandoned in public space. And so when I look at the city of Barcelona, knowing what is happening in smart city policy and the technologies that are being implemented, what I see is a graveyard of smart devices. There's so many sensors that have been abandoned because they didn't find a business model, and no one knows who's supposed to dismantle that. So I think there's a great potential in technology for cities, but there's also great risks, and when we do need to talk about those. And what I found, what I just mentioned, it was an imposed blindness, this inability, like unwillingness to acknowledge what things were not being done well. And that is a problem, because if you want to diagnose something and solve something, the first thing you need to do is acknowledge that you do have a problem, and that's been hard for cities. So that was what happened in Barcelona, when Barcelona was like the poster girl, the poster boy for smart cities. And then something remarkable happened. In 2014, the government changed. And one of the reasons why there was a change, a quite unexpected change of government, was because of the smart city policy. The year before the election, we had two things that were quite remarkable. First, in one of the poorest neighborhoods in Barcelona, there was a plan to build a Fab Lab, and the neighbors stormed the building because they wanted a food bank. For them, food was way more important than technology. So there was clearly something broken in the discourse of smart cities, because people were failing to realize that was for them, and they clearly had other priorities. And there was also an organized campaign against smart lampposts. When the city council made public how much it was paying for smart lampposts, neighbors organized themselves to say, we have other priorities. We do not want smart lampposts that we don't know who they're going to work for. Having wireless, it's not a priority for some people, especially if it comes out of a lamppost. You never know the speed that you'll get it. So it's like, there was a problem with the communication of what the smart city could do to the majority of the people. And the new government actually came to power with a discourse against the established smart city. So once the new government was in the city hall, there was a need for a new practice. However, the new government had the discourse, they don't want the smart city as it had been conceived by the former government, but there isn't really an alternative. And so that's what we've been working on. They've come up with the term technological sovereignty, linking sovereignty to popular sovereignty. So the idea that the technology needs to work for the majority of the people. And that's all good and well, but how do you translate that into engineering, and what does that mean for the infrastructure of the city? But in any case, we have an opportunity to rethink the smart city under different values, or rethink the relationship between the technology and the city. We don't need to call it smart city. And decide how we want, exactly what Michael was saying, how do we want human needs and our vision of what cities should be to decide what technology should do. So we've been working with the town hall for 4 months, doing lots of workshops with everyone involved, implementing our data impact assessment framework, where we look at the law and ethics, desirability, acceptability, and the data management of any of the processes involved, like the back end of the smart city. We work with them to retrace the data lifecycle and to incorporate values at all moments of vulnerability. So any data that gets into the city, we look at the moment of collection, storage, analysis, sharing, and deletion, and we see what issues could be changed to improve the quality of the data management cycle, but also to incorporate values into that process. But the back end of the smart city actually looks like this. It's a mess. Like, I feel that many of the discourses that we often hear bear no relationship to the actual challenges that people feel when they're working in public administration on anything related to the digital or to technology. Just to sum up, what we have in cities are extremely complex systems with feet of clay. The way we have taken up technology in our societies, not only in cities, is by creating all these new practices that we put on top of ways of working that date back to the 18th century. We have never rethought government and public procurement as if the internet existed. No one's ever gone back to rethinking, now that we have technology, how do we rethink the city or any other thing in our societies? And therefore, we just build sets of practices on top of a giant that has feet of clay. And it's really hard to work on that because at some point this is going to collapse. And that's very clearly what we see. I mean, this is unsustainable. The cybersecurity risks, the risks of unethical data handling, not only in artificial intelligence, but in everyday handling of personal data, are just massive. And we see that every time we work with actually existing public administration. We are now coming up with a network of 20 cities to start testing new ways of working with data. And we see the same thing over and over and over again. None of the cities that we work with have ever come up with a data management strategy. They have no idea what their data architecture is. It doesn't exist. There's different people managing different technologies, but they've never sat together to think, how do our systems relate to one another? What do we want to achieve? How do we want the technological infrastructure of the city to actually look like? That conversation is not happening at the public administration level, not only at the city level. We've also seen how technological issues are very much intertwined with organizational issues. You may have the best solution in engineering terms, but then try to implement that. Try to get people who've worked in a certain way for 30 years, try to tell them from now on, this is how you do things. Try to seduce them to working differently. It's just really hard, and you need a plan. And so engineers alone find it really hard to tackle this in the same way that policymakers alone or academics alone cannot tackle this issue from all the points that it needs to be tackled from. So what we do is we work both backwards and forwards. So we have a plan to improve procurement from now on and to make sure that from now on there is a data architecture, that from now on the systems have changed. From now on there's some kind of accountability in what is bought and installed in urban centers, but also how do we make sense of the mess that we've inherited? How do we take all those cables and start pulling them one by one and putting them in order? Because that's what it takes to actually come up with an accountable data structure for a city. We've also seen how procurement is out of control. We haven't seen any public administration that knows how to procure technology. It's just really hard. Most people that control what is bought from a public administration don't really know what they're buying, don't really know what technologies should do, how they should work, and that is clearly a problem. So what we're doing, you may know that as of next year, all public administrations in Europe need to transition to e-procurement. So we're using the transition to e-procurement as a moment to incorporate values in the process. So it's a technological transition that needs to happen anyway. And so we get on top of that and we make sure that it happens in a way that allows us to rethink procurement as if the internet existed. And we'll see how that goes. We still have a year for that. We might be a bit delayed because it's a very complex process. And so what we're doing, and what we're trying to do not only with Barcelona, but with the network of 20 cities, is come up with a city data directive to see what the policy for data in a city may look like. And that includes a data management plan, where we include issues of planning, budgeting, procuring, data architecture, governance, privacy, and security. So we've developed a data management checklist a security and privacy management plan, an open data management plan, a big data management plan, an ethical data strategy, state-of-the-art of privacy-enhancing technologies and anonymization to see to what extent we can start to implement those in the systems that we develop, reference clauses for procurement on open privacy, ethical, security, and social, and a plan for the transformation and organizational change. And we hope that through that we can create a template that can be used elsewhere to start changing these processes and to start to be able to think about the things that were raised here today. Because I think that oftentimes some of the discourses that we have on artificial intelligence or anything else are very interesting. But how do you couple that with a room full of messy cables? But also, how do you take into account the issues that are happening and that we're not addressing? There's one thing that I find extremely worrying, which is the issue of data despotism. We talk a lot about discrimination, algorithmic discrimination, and all these negative impacts of data. But what I see in cities is how technology is being used more and more as an excuse to never talk to people again. Data despotism is a way of saying everything for the people, with the data of the people, but without the people. And there's more and more of that. I talk to more and more policymakers and people in administration saying, why do I need to talk to citizens if now I know when they get on the bus, when they get off the bus, what they do after they go to the bus, where they shop, how they pay their taxes. I know everything about them. So I don't really need to go down to the street and interact with them. So technology, which was supposed to improve the relationship between those that govern us and the governed and I don't know how to translate that, the rulers and the ruled, in the end, is an excuse to do exactly the opposite. So it's extremely counterintuitive that you see that the practice of data management and data processes is the exact opposite of its declared goals, which is highly problematic. So I truly encourage you to start looking at the risks of the actual existing smart cities, while we also warn about the things that are definitely going to come, the issues of algorithmic discrimination, artificial intelligence, and all the inefficiencies that come with the interaction between technology and complex processes. But I strongly encourage you to look at the actual reality of the smart city and to start addressing those issues and to start creating the best practices that will allow the rest of the world to get in line with a better way of relating human processes to technological processes. Thank you.
Okay, we have about 15 to 20 minutes of questions, and as William said at the beginning, what we'll have to do is you can ask your question. I'll repeat it with the microphone so everybody can hear and it can be recorded. It's not a wireless mic, unfortunately. It has a wire on it, so we can't pass it around. So please, raise your hand if you want to ask a question. And preferably if you can address the questions to all members of the panel, that would be useful, but obviously you won't necessarily be able to help addressing them to some individuals as well. So questions, please. From the floor. Who wants to be the first? Otherwise, I'll take the opportunity to. Yeah, you can actually have this.
Thank you. Hi, my name's Gilad Rosner, Internet of Things Privacy Forum. I was curious as to whether or not there are any collaborations amongst cities where they themselves are getting together to create governance frameworks or other types of practices that they are promoting from within, either from parts, specific parts within the city government or, pan-city efforts.
It's a short answer. As far as I know, no, there aren't. There's several networks of cities that incorporate technology as part of what they do. So C40 working on environmental sustainability. They have a small group that works on data processes, helping cities better deal with data for environmental issues. It's fine. But they're not managing to make it work because it's such a complex issue that it's hard to have it just as an add-on to a network that works on different things. So one of the things that we're realizing is the need to develop a specific network of cities that helps them tackle these kind of issues. So we're now working with the Smart City Congress to develop that as a space for training and get together and see what comes out of that. But I think that the only way to tackle this properly is to actually have a space that only deals with data management issues and not just these issues from an environmental perspective or a social sustainability perspective or any kind of the other things that existing networks already do. So there's a massive gap there.
Do you then see the more pragmatic approach is to take a lot of these issues, such as dignity issues and such as privacy and data protection issues, and roll them up into a data management lens?
Cities need reference policies, and these don't exist at the moment. So every city has to start from scratch. That was the initial problem when we were asked by the city of Barcelona to develop their ethical data strategy. We're like, sure, give us your data strategy and we'll make it ethical. Then they were like, there's no data strategy. And then we realized the problem is way bigger than we initially envisioned. We thought we were going to find a messy space because it's public administration, large organizations, but we didn't expect to find such a void and such a lack of compliance with the current legal norms. We talk about it, a lot about technology and law and everything. Even the most basic principles of data protection are not being upheld in local administrations because it's impossible to organize the information. No one knows what happens to the data once it gets in. The only way we can audit systems is by reverse engineering them. When we ask them for the specifications to do what you would usually do, to get the specifications and then do some tests, it's impossible because the relationship between the specifications and the final product that they actually implemented are usually lost because the system comes from outside. So we see a lot of private capture of public processes through technology that no one's looking at. We've seen a lot of contracts dealing with very sensitive information of citizens that don't mention data issues. They're the basis of the system, but it's as if they were not there. So there's the level of inefficiency and lack of compliance is scary.
And I'd just like to add something to that, is that we're talking in Europe, of course, that places that actually pretend to be concerned about data. I mean, one of the interesting things for the rest of the world is there are many places that don't even pretend to be concerned about this. So Brazil didn't even have a data protection law, for example, until a couple of years ago. And I know the guy who was trying to develop it, he was basically brought over to develop this law and then was ignored for 10 years by successive governments. And this law is completely inadequate anyway when it has been produced. So you've got things like the Rio Smart City, the famous example we're all supposed to look to, which is developed in the complete absence of data protection laws. It's not even there. They didn't even pretend to care when it was developed. You look at Modi's 100 Smart City plan in India, where again, there's no pretense that this is about social justice or fairness or privacy or anything like that. It's about smart cities for the wealthy. It's about providing upper middle class, tech savvy people with basically gated, digitally enhanced communities. And so we've got to think very carefully when we think about what's normal in Europe and how that might be transferred. In the rest of the world, there's many other jurisdictions don't even pretend to care about the same issues in the first place. So not that they're not doing what they're supposed to. It's actually the overt purpose of smart cities is not the same, right? It's not actually even thought of as being something that's promoting justice, equality, privacy, and those kind of issues. Exactly the opposite, in fact. Anybody else have a comment?
Yeah, maybe just a quick remark from my side. So another place where cities come together are European research projects, obviously, who also include partners from different municipalities. And what I found striking there is, there's an overview report on European smart city initiatives, that there is much more collaboration in certain domains than in others. So there's a lot of collaboration going on towards the transition to a more sustainable lifestyle. There's very little collaboration going on with regard to justice issues, including access to the labor market. And that shows you two things, that on one hand, there is a certain bias focusing on certain domains, and there is this divide in certain domains. So there are some topics that are way more fancy or seem more attractive for cities to engage in, and other topics that are not. And that, of course, also indicates that there is no upper level approach of developing an overall data management strategy, what you would expect within one municipality.
You have to shout your question out, and I'll repeat it if people can, for the purpose of the tape.
Okay. When we talk about smart cities, human civilization is all about interaction. So, interaction between, if I divide between urban areas and rural areas, most of the time I hear about smart cities. I don't hear about smart villages or smart rural areas, but in relation to the last presentation, when I talk about governance of smart cities, definitely there will be interaction with the rural areas as well. how do we promote or maintain this governance of relationship between cities and rural areas in the context of surveillance, privacy, or the smart technologies?
Okay, so just for the recording, the question was concerning the relationship between the urban and the rural in smart cities and how we promote both better relationship and accountability and all the values we've talked about in that context. Does anybody want to have a go at answering that?
Very quickly, when a term causes more problems than it solves, you have a problem with the term, and I think that's the case we have with smart cities. There's no such thing as a smart city. If you look at, go to any website of any city and look at what they include as smart city, it doesn't make any sense. Like in Barcelona, you have non-technological things that are part of the smart city because they're good practices. Like, so it's not smart city, it's good practice, and it doesn't matter if it's technological. It's just, at the moment, it's just a marketing strategy. It's not an academic term, something that we can defend. And one of the problems that the smart city term has encountered, that it's because it means so many things and it means nothing at the same time, and it's not operationable because some issues are the same in the rural world. So why call it smart city? Why not smart things or smart infrastructures or whatever? One of the problems is that by not defining the concept, I think they've killed it, because it's so impossible, it's so difficult for people to understand where it begins and where it ends and how to focus on the problems at hand, that people are just starting to drop it as an operational terms. But I definitely think there's a lot of room for collaboration with rural environments, especially because technology oftentimes does away with time and space because of the ability to communicate in real time.
I would just quickly add that I think smart cities is a very, very useful term for those who advocate for it, because of course they then get to claim all the victories and distance themselves from all the failures of the smart city. And you very rightly point out that really the most important thing to look at is the various elements and components that create similar problems, and the issue of the surveillance assemblage and how we can address those. And really the context does not even necessarily change how we should view any one of those individual harms.
And for me, fundamentally, what we're talking about is a question of digital infrastructures of various kinds. And so fundamentally, there shouldn't be any underlying difference between the city and other kinds of elements. Of course, the thing about cities is they often present unified bodies, which it's easy for a particular corporation, for example, to target more clearly than, say, a more diverse and dispersed rural area. So you can actually present a city as being a sort of, a successful case study in a way that you can't, and you can actually, as I said, sell stuff, basically, large amounts of expensive equipment. The procurement issue is very, very important. I think really glad you brought that up. It's something I've been worried about too. So I think there's a lot to do with the political economy here of how these things operate. That explains why rural areas are not considered in the same way. They don't offer the same value proposition, basically. There's a lot more expense involved in wiring up, say, rural areas, and less benefit immediately for corporations in both terms of returns, but also sort of supplementary benefits that they can supplementary market benefits that they can produce, I think.
At the same time, I think we need to recognize that a lot of technological innovation is precisely taking place in rural areas at this moment. If you talk about smart vehicles, self-driving vehicles, the largest fleet is built by John Deere. The area of innovation for drones, surveillance drones included, is rural areas, because they are not allowed to fly within urban terrains. So where we see now innovations happening is in rural areas. So I think it's really, really important that, to keep in mind that smart cities can be distracting because smart technologies are also employed to a great extent in the rural areas. And partly projects aim to do justice to that. So for example, in the Netherlands, there's a try to build metropolitan areas out of smaller towns, which effectively then function as one operational unit by using this kind of smart technology. I haven't looked into the privacy implication of that, but of course that means data exchange at least, so might be worthwhile to explore that option as well.
We had a question at the back.
No, I think I was just going to add that I think that there's a lot of work, especially in agriculture, that is basically about surveilling and creating a technical infrastructure that undoes the current existing structures, especially with farmers and people living in rural areas. So maybe actually it's a recommendation for Cpdp to do an event that focuses on that. Also with the Global South, that some of these companies will look into basically what the think it's a big issue. And the other one I think is to think of like the aggregated city. So I think a company like Uber has access to not just one city but multiple cities in different areas. So instead of thinking of a single city, it's also thinking about these companies as like aggregate city managers and what that means. I think that might be interesting.
Okay, but yeah, we think maybe the last one before we impinge on the next session too much. So, see if you can.
Yeah. Okay, I'm Anna Bertisuman from Tilburg Institute for Law, Technology and Society, and I will have a question about the first speech in which you were talking about the individuals as secondary to the systems and the conforming element as a key element for participating to smart cities. But what I didn't hear was about really bottom-up initiatives, so where citizens themselves answer to their own needs, presenting initiatives. For example, in Nijmegen, here in the Netherlands, there has been very grassroots initiatives. So I was thinking, what about if the policymaker could look at these initiatives and then frame their own projects based on these bottom-up initiatives, and also this could be another way round of surveillance, so the citizens surveilling the compliance of the policymakers, not the policymakers surveilling that. So this would be my question. Thank you. Sorry.
Just briefly before, I'm not sure Gemma has something to say about this as well, and others too, but I'm actually writing a piece about exactly this at the moment, trying to think about the empowering versions of the smart city. And there are many initiatives, and one of the, we've seen the rise of, for example, hacker spaces and city hacking events all over the world. One of the interesting things, of course, is as soon as these become big and important, you get the corporate entities trying to sort of essentially come into this. So I don't know if anybody knows about the CrossFit idea, the fitness, kind of craze that took over a few years ago. Pretty much Reebok bought this out and now brands CrossFit as Reebok CrossFit all over the place. So almost all the bottom-up version of that doesn't really exist anymore in the same way. Microsoft is trying to do the same thing to hacker spaces. And in fact, it was in Barcelona I first saw a Microsoft hackerspace where they basically tried to present it as one of these bottom-up initiatives, and it looked exactly the same, but there's little Microsoft logos at the bottom. And essentially it was about, basically incorporating kids and so on into the sort of Microsoft ecology. And I think, I'm not particularly singling out Microsoft here, by the way. There's a lot of people at this. But one of the problems with citizen initiatives like this is they too easily then, conform, go and give into the temptation of corporate funding. So they get successful and then they become part of some kind of group like that. It's very difficult to resist that sort of lure when you're a small group without funding. So they are is a really good thing, and we've got to find, I think, policies that will promote that kind of citizen engagement without, and not, I think also not romanticize the idea of citizen engagement as if in itself it's going to be the thing that achieves something. There can be very good examples, but they're often ephemeral and they don't last very long by definition, right? People get together and they split apart again. And maybe we need to develop ways of managing cities that allow that sort of thing to be more significant and not to worry that they don't have a permanent outcome or actionable objectives and some kind of, way of assessing these things. Anyway, sorry, I've been told we have to stop. So does anybody else have a brief comment before we finish? Okay. Michael said it wouldn't be brief if he was allowed to comment. Okay. Yeah. The panelists say anybody wants to talk afterwards, they're around for the whole conference. So I'd just like to thank all the panelists who came today and our wonderful chair as well for his work. So stick around for another excellent panel and we'll see you soon.